The winter rain came down in sheets that Thursday evening, turning the sidewalk outside the Grand Plaza Hotel into a shimmering mirror of city lights. Richard Westfield pulled his cashmere coat tighter as he stepped from the warmth of the lobby into the cold December air. He'd just closed the biggest deal of his career, a $20 million merger that would secure his legacy. His reflection in the hotel's glass doors showed a man who'd made it, truly made it, after 40 years of climbing from nothing to everything. That's when he saw him. An old man sat hunched against the building's marble wall, a cardboard sign resting on his knees. The words were simple: hungry. Please help. Their eyes met for just a second, and Richard felt something stir in his chest, something he'd learned long ago to ignore. He turned away quickly, stepping toward his waiting car. But the old man's voice stopped him cold. I know what you did, Richard. I know what you've forgotten. Where are you watching from tonight? Richard froze mid-step, his polished shoes barely an inch from the curb. The December wind cut through the narrow canyon of buildings, carrying with it the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart and the distant wail of sirens. He told himself to keep walking. Street people said all sorts of things. Desperate words meant to trigger guilt, to manipulate, to extract a few dollars from anyone foolish enough to listen. He'd heard it all before in this city, but something about the way this man said his name, the certainty in those words, made Richard's carefully constructed armor crack just a little. He turned slowly, forcing his expression into the cool mask he wore in boardrooms. I'm sorry, do I know you? His voice came out sharper than he intended, defensive even to his own ears. The old man shifted against the cold marble, his weathered face partially hidden beneath a wool cap that had seen better decades. His coat was clean but threadbare, held together with mismatched buttons. But his eyes, those eyes carried something Richard recognized, though he couldn't place it. Wisdom, maybe, or sadness, or both. You don't remember me, the man said quietly. It wasn't a question. But you should remember what happened 37 years ago. December 15th, 1988. Does that date mean anything to you, Richard? Richard's mind raced backward through the years, through countless deals and contracts and business dinners. December 1988. He would have been 28 then, just starting out, hungry and ambitious and willing to do whatever it took to climb out of the neighborhood where he'd grown up. That was the year everything changed, the year he'd landed his first real investor, the year his company finally took off. But the exact date, he couldn't recall anything significant. I think you have me confused with someone else, Richard said, though uncertainty crept into his voice. His driver, Carlos, waited patiently at the car's open door, pretending not to listen. The old man reached into his coat pocket with trembling fingers, and Richard instinctively took a step back. But what emerged wasn't a weapon or a demand. It was a photograph, creased and faded, protected in a clear plastic sleeve. The man held it out, and despite every instinct telling him to leave, Richard found himself moving closer, leaning down to look. The photograph showed a small apartment building he knew well, or had known once. The brick facade was distinctive, with that crooked fire escape he used to climb as a shortcut to the roof. His childhood home. Standing in front of it were two people, a teenage boy with Richard's own young face, thin and serious, and an older man with kind eyes and a warm smile, his arm around the boy's shoulders. Richard felt his breath catch. Mr. Morrison, Richard whispered, the name emerging from somewhere deep in his memory, a place he'd walled off long ago. My father, the old man said softly. Thomas Morrison. You remember him now? How could Richard have forgotten? Tom Morrison had been his neighbor, had lived 2 doors down from Richard's family in that cramped building in Queens. When Richard's father died suddenly, leaving his mother with 3 kids and mountains of debt, it was Tom Morrison who'd stepped in. He'd given Richard his first real job, working weekends at his small hardware store. More than that, he'd believed in Richard when no one else did. He'd listened to a teenager's wild dreams about starting a business, about making something of himself, about never being poor again. I remember, Richard said, his voice barely audible over the city's evening symphony. Then you remember what you promised. The old man's words weren't accusing, just factual, and somehow that made them hit harder. The night before you left for college, you sat in our kitchen. My father had just given you the money you needed for your first semester, money he'd saved for his own retirement. You looked him in the eye and promised you'd never forget where you came from, that you'd remember the people who helped you climb. Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the December wind. He did remember that night, the weight of Tom Morrison's faith in him, the envelope of carefully saved bills pressed into his hands. He remembered promising to pay it back, to stay in touch, to always remember. And then life had happened. Success had happened. The years had blurred together in a rush of meetings and mergers, of climbing higher and higher until the old neighborhood, the old promises, the old Richard, all seemed like someone else's story. "Where is Mr. Morrison now?" Richard asked, though he already sensed the answer from the sadness in this man's eyes. "He passed away 3 years ago," the man said simply. "Died alone in a nursing home in Jersey City. I tried to find you, to let you know, but you'd changed your number. Your old building had been torn down. It was like you'd vanished into a different world." The rain began to fall harder, and Richard stood there on the sidewalk, caught between the warm car waiting to take him to his penthouse and this cold truth sitting at his feet. Richard felt his carefully ordered world tilt on its axis. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead, but he barely noticed. Behind him, Carlos cleared his throat gently, a subtle reminder that the car was waiting, that Richard had dinner reservations at 8, that his routine was being disrupted. But Richard couldn't move. He stared at this man, Tom Morrison's son, and saw his own reflection in a mirror he'd been avoiding for decades. "What's your name?" Richard asked, his voice rough. "David. David Morrison." The man shifted again, wincing slightly as if his back pained him. "I'm not here for money, Mr. Westfield. I want you to know that. I've got my pride, same as anyone. But I've been homeless for 6 months now, ever since I lost my job and then my apartment. And when I saw you walk out of that hotel tonight, looking so successful, so comfortable, He paused, collecting himself. "I just wanted you to remember, to know that forgetting people isn't free. It costs something." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He thought of his morning, breakfast prepared by his housekeeper, his driver waiting to take him anywhere he wished, his closet full of suits that cost more than David probably saw in a month. He thought of the charitable foundation he'd started, the galas he attended where he wrote checks and posed for photographs, the plaques on his office wall thanking him for his generosity. All of it suddenly felt hollow, like he'd been playing at goodness while ignoring the one person who had the greatest claim to his gratitude. "Why didn't you reach out sooner?" Richard heard himself ask, and immediately regretted it. The question sounded like an accusation, like this was somehow David's fault, but David just smiled sadly. "I did, actually. About 15 years ago. I wrote to your office. I wasn't asking for anything. My father had just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and I thought you'd want to know. Thought maybe you'd like to visit him while he could still remember you. Your secretary sent back a form letter saying you received hundreds of requests and couldn't respond personally to each one." He pulled his thin coat tighter. "That's when I understood. You weren't the Richard my father remembered. You'd become someone else." The truth of it burned in Richard's chest. He had become someone else. Deliberately, carefully, systematically. He'd shed his old life like a snake sheds its skin, convinced that success required leaving the past behind. He'd changed his accent, his wardrobe, his habits, even his laugh. He'd moved his mother to a comfortable apartment in Florida and sent her money every month, but he visited maybe twice a year. His old friends from the neighborhood had stopped calling after he'd canceled on them too many times. He'd told himself it was necessary, that you couldn't build a new life while clinging to the old one. But looking at David Morrison sitting in the rain, Richard suddenly understood what he'd really been doing. He'd been running from the scared kid who'd worn second-hand clothes to school, from the teenager who'd worked 3 jobs to help his mother pay rent, from the young man who'd needed help and had been given it freely by a hardware store owner who saw potential in him. "I'm so sorry," Richard said, and the words felt inadequate, childish even. "I should have been there. For your father, for you." "There's no excuse." David looked up at him, and Richard saw no anger in his eyes, just a deep weariness. "My father used to say you'd come back someday. Even when the Alzheimer's took most of his memories, he'd still talk about Richard, the bright boy who was going to change the world. He never stopped believing in you. David's voice cracked slightly. I guess I just wanted you to know that. And to ask you one thing. Anything, Richard said, and meant it. When you go home tonight to your warm apartment, when you eat your dinner and sleep in your comfortable bed, just remember this moment. Remember that there are people who helped you get there, and maybe, just maybe, decide if you want to be the kind of man my father thought you were, or the kind of man you've become. The rain fell harder, turning the photograph in David's hands into a blur of colors. Richard pulled out his wallet, but David raised a hand. I told you I'm not here for money. I know, Richard said quietly, but I'm not offering it as charity. I'm offering it as a debt I should have paid long ago. He pulled out every bill in his wallet, several $100s, and pressed it into David's reluctant hands. Then he took off his cashmere coat and draped it over David's shoulders. The cold bit immediately through Richard's suit jacket, but it felt right somehow, like a tiny payment on an enormous debt. This doesn't fix anything, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. But I want to help. Really help. Will you let me? David looked at the money, at the coat, at Richard's face, and something shifted in his expression. If this moment touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up. You really mean that? David asked carefully. I do, Richard said. I've spent 37 years forgetting. Maybe it's time I spend some years remembering. David nodded slowly, then reached into his other pocket and pulled out a worn business card. This is the shelter where I stay most nights. St. Vincent's on 42nd Street. If you really want to help, don't send a check. Come yourself. See the people there. See what your father's friend's son has become. The challenge hung in the air between them, and Richard knew his answer would define everything that came next. Richard stood outside St. Vincent's shelter 3 days later, his hand hovering over the heavy wooden door. The building was old, sandwiched between a laundromat and a bodega in a neighborhood Richard hadn't visited in 2 decades. Christmas lights blinked weakly in nearby windows, and somewhere a radio played carols that seemed almost mocking in this forgotten corner of the city. He'd made excuse after excuse since that rainy night. He was too busy. He had meetings. David would understand if he just sent money instead. But each excuse felt more poisonous than the last. And finally, on this gray Saturday afternoon, he'd gotten in his car and driven here alone, telling no one where he was going. The shelter's interior smelled of coffee and industrial soap and something else, the particular scent of too many people in too small a space, all of them carrying the weight of circumstances that had crushed them. A young woman at the front desk looked up, surprise flickering across her face at the sight of Richard's expensive suit. Can I help you? I'm looking for David Morrison, Richard said. He told me I could find him here. She nodded toward a large room where men and women of all ages sat at long tables, some eating, others just staring into space with the particular emptiness that comes from having nowhere else to go. Richard found David in the corner, reading a tattered paperback, still wearing Richard's coat. When David looked up and saw him, genuine shock registered on his face. You came, David said simply. I said I would. Richard sat down on the bench across from him, feeling utterly out of place. I've been thinking about what you said, about becoming someone else. You were right. Over the next hour, David told him stories Richard wished he'd heard years ago. He spoke about his father's hardware store, how Tom Morrison had known every customer by name, how he'd extended credit to families when times were hard, never expecting to be paid back. He talked about his own life, a marriage that ended after he lost his job, a son he hadn't seen in 2 years because shame kept him away, a series of setbacks that had knocked him down and kept him there. But he spoke without self-pity, just honest recognition of how quickly a life could unravel. The thing is, David said, stirring a cup of weak coffee, I don't blame you for forgetting. I understand it, actually. Success is seductive. It whispers that you did it all yourself, that you don't owe anyone anything. But my father taught me different. He used to say that we're all just 1 or 2 bad breaks away from needing help ourselves. That remembering where you came from isn't about guilt. It's about gratitude. Richard felt something break open inside him, something that had been locked tight for so long, he'd forgotten it was there. He thought about his own children, grown now and living on opposite coasts, whom he barely knew. He'd given them everything money could buy and nothing of himself. He thought about the employees at his company, names he didn't know, faces he didn't recognize, people whose labor built his success while he took all the credit. He thought about his mother in Florida, waiting by the phone for calls that came too rarely. "I've made so many mistakes," Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to fix them." "Start with one," David suggested. "That's what my father would say. You can't fix everything at once, but you can take one step, then another, then another." Richard pulled out his phone and, sitting there in the shelter, made a call he'd been putting off for months. His son answered on the fourth ring, surprise evident in his voice. "Dad, is everything okay?" "I'm fine," Richard said. I wanted to talk to you. Really talk. Not about business or money, just, how are you? How's your life?" The conversation was awkward at first, stilted, filled with the weight of years of emotional distance. But slowly, carefully, they began to find their way towards something real. Have you ever faced a moment when you realized you'd lost touch with the people who mattered most? Let us know in the comments, because understanding that feeling is where change begins. When Richard hung up 20 minutes later, his hands were shaking, but he felt lighter somehow. "That's a start," David said, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "See? Not so hard." "Actually, it was terrifying," Richard admitted. "But you're right. It was necessary." David leaned forward, his expression serious. "There's something else I need to tell you, Richard. Something about my father's last days. Something I think you need to hear, even if it's hard." Richard braced himself, sensing that whatever came next would change everything one more time. "Tell me," he said. "I'm ready to hear it." David's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since that rainy night, Richard saw the full depth of pain this man had been carrying. In his last weeks, when the Alzheimer's had taken almost everything, my father would still have these moments of clarity. And do you know what he'd say? He'd ask about you. "Did Richard ever come by?" he'd ask me. "Is he doing well? Did he achieve his dreams?" I'd tell him yes, that you were successful, that you'd made it big. And you know what he'd say? David paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Good," he'd say. "That's good. I knew he would. But I hope he's happy. I hope he remembered to stay kind." Even then, even when he couldn't remember my name half the time, he remembered you. He remembered believing in you. And his biggest worry wasn't that you'd forgotten him. It was that you'd lost yourself in the process of succeeding. The words hit Richard like a tidal wave. Here was a man who'd given him everything, who'd asked for nothing in return, whose final thoughts had been concern for Richard's soul rather than bitterness about being forgotten. Richard put his face in his hands, and for the first time in decades, perhaps since his own father's funeral, he wept. Not the careful, controlled tears of a man who'd learned to hide his emotions, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place he'd locked away so long ago he'd almost forgotten it existed. The shelter around them went quiet. Other residents looked over, but no one mocked or stared rudely. They understood grief here. They understood breaking points. A few even nodded in silent solidarity, recognizing the moment when a man finally faces the truth about himself. "I'm so sorry," Richard managed to say between sobs. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. That I didn't say goodbye. That I let him down." "But you didn't let him down," David said gently, reaching across the table to grip Richard's shoulder. "That's what I'm trying to tell you. His faith in you never wavered. Even at the end, he believed you were good. He believed you'd find your way back. And look, here you are. You proved him right." Richard looked up, his vision blurred. "But I almost didn't come," I almost sent money and forgot about you again. I almost kept being the person I'd become." "Almost doesn't matter," David said firmly. "What matters is that you chose to come. You chose to remember. That's what my father would have wanted. Not perfection, just the willingness to try." They sat together for a long time, two men from different worlds brought together by a debt that could never be fully repaid, but might perhaps be honored. Finally, Richard straightened up, wiping his face with his handkerchief. His eyes were red, his expensive suit rumpled from sitting on the shelter's worn benches, but he felt more present, more real, than he had in years. "I want to do something," Richard said. "Not just for you, but for this place, for people who need help. But I don't want to just write a check and walk away. I want to actually be involved. I want to remember what it means to see people, not just problems to solve from a distance." David studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "The shelter needs volunteers, people to serve meals, to listen, to just be present. Could you do that? Could you show up regularly, get your hands dirty, hear people's stories?" "Yes," Richard said without hesitation. "I can do that. I want to do that." "And David," Richard continued, "I want to help you specifically, not as charity, but as family. That's what you were to me once. Family. Let me help you find a job, a place to stay. Let me help you reconnect with your son. Let me try to honor your father's memory by taking care of his son the way he took care of me." David's composure finally cracked. His own tears came, and the two men stood and embraced, right there in the crowded shelter, while around them life continued its difficult dance. If you've been moved by this journey, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Over the following weeks, Richard kept his promise. He came to the shelter every Saturday, serving meals alongside David, learning the names and stories of the people there. He used his business connections to help David find work at a small construction company, and he co-signed on an apartment lease. He even tracked down David's son and helped facilitate a tearful reunion. But more than any of that, he began the harder work of rebuilding his own life, of reaching out to his children, of visiting his mother, of remembering the people who'd helped him along the way. Christmas came, and Richard spent it not at some fancy restaurant, but at the shelter, helping serve turkey to 200 people who had nowhere else to go. His children came with him, surprised by the invitation, but grateful for it. And as Richard looked around the room, at David laughing with other residents, at his own kids discovering the reward of service, he felt something he hadn't felt in decades: peace. 3 months later, on a clear March morning, Richard stood in front of a small hardware store in Queens. The building was new, built on the site where Tom Morrison's original shop had stood before urban renewal had torn it down decades ago. The sign above the door read, "Morrison's Hardware, founded 1975, restored 2025. And beneath it, in smaller letters, "In memory of Thomas Morrison, who believed in second chances." Richard had bought the property quietly, working with David to recreate something of what Tom Morrison had built, not just a business, but a community gathering place. They'd restored the old-fashioned wooden shelves, the pegboards full of tools, the counter where Tom had once stood offering advice on home repairs, along with wisdom about life. But they'd also added something new, a small community room in the fee, back where local kids could get help with homework, where job seekers could use computers, where neighbors could gather and remember what it meant to look out for each other. David stood beside Richard now, wearing a work apron with the store's logo, his face healthier than it had been that rainy night in December. He'd regained weight, his eyes had lost that haunted look, and most importantly, he'd regained his dignity. His son, Michael, was inside the store, learning the business, rebuilding the relationship with his father one careful day at a time. "You know what the strangest part of all this is?" David said, looking at the store. "I spent so long being angry at how life turned out, at all the things I'd lost. But if I hadn't hit bottom, If I hadn't been sitting outside that hotel, you and I would never have had that conversation. Sometimes our lowest moments lead to the most important changes. Richard nodded, understanding the truth of it in his bones. That cold December night had broken something open in him, had cracked through the armor he'd spent decades building. The months since had been among the hardest of his life, facing who he'd become, making amends where possible, learning to be present instead of always racing toward the next achievement. His business partners had been baffled by his new priorities, his insistence on knowing employees' names, his habit of volunteering at the shelter every Saturday. Some thought he was having a midlife crisis. A few had suggested therapy, but Richard had never been more certain of anything. He'd spent 40 years climbing toward a version of success that left him empty and alone. Now he was building something different, not a legacy measured in dollars or deals, but in relationships restored, in kindness extended, in promises kept even when they came decades too late. His daughter Emma had moved back to New York to help run the foundation Richard had restructured. Instead of writing checks from a distance, they now worked directly with communities, funding programs that gave people genuine opportunities, not just handouts. His son, James, called him every week now, sometimes just to talk about nothing in particular, and those conversations meant more to Richard than any business triumph ever had. Even his relationship with his mother had transformed. She'd cried when he told her the whole story about forgetting Tom Morrison, about finding David, about remembering who he used to be. "I was so proud of your success," she'd said, "but I missed my son. I'm glad he's back." Now, as Richard watched David unlock the hardware store's door for its grand opening, he understood what Tom Morrison had tried to teach him all those years ago. Success meant nothing if you lost your humanity in the pursuit of it. Wealth meant nothing if you hoarded it selfishly. Achievement meant nothing if you climbed by stepping on the people who'd helped you up. Customers began arriving, neighbors, from the old days, families who'd known Tom Morrison, young people who'd heard about the community programs, reporters curious about Richard Westfield's unexpected transformation. Richard stepped back, letting David take center stage. This was his moment. His father's legacy continued. Richard was just grateful to be part of it. An older woman approached Richard, her face familiar, though he couldn't immediately place her. "You don't remember me," she said with a kind smile. "I'm Margaret Chen. I lived in your building when you were a boy. Your mother and I were friends." Recognition dawned. Mrs. Chen, who'd babysat him sometimes, who'd brought food when his father died. Another person he'd forgotten in his rush towards success. "Mrs. Chen," he said warmly, taking her hand. "It's so good to see you. How have you been?" They talked for a while, and she told him how proud she was of what he was doing, how the neighborhood had missed him, how wonderful it was to see him return not with condescension, but with humility and genuine care. And in that conversation, Richard understood something else. He wasn't just rebuilding relationships. He was coming home. Not to a place exactly, but to a version of himself he'd lost. The boy who'd believed in community, who'd understood that we all rise or fall together, who'd known that the measure of a man wasn't his bank account, but his character. As the day drew to a close and the last customers left, David turned to Richard with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for remembering, for coming back, for honoring my father this way. Thank you," Richard replied, "for not giving up on me, for believing I could still become the person your father saw in me." They stood together as the spring sun set over Queens. Two men who'd found their way back from very different kinds of poverty, one of means, one of spirit, and who'd helped each other discover that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to face their failures and humble enough to try again. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments about times when you reconnected with important people or values in your own life. And subscribe to our channel for more stories about the power of remembering who we are and who we're meant to be. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May we all find the courage to come home to ourselves and to the people who've believed in us along the way.